Okay, so here's something that should terrify Detroit, confuse Washington, and frankly, it's absolutely fascinating. While America is building walls, tariff walls, to be specific against Chinese electric vehicles, our neighbors to the north just rolled out the red carpet for BYD. Yes, that BYD. The company that's selling EVs in Europe for the price of a used Honda Civic. And let me tell you, this isn't just about cars. This is about the future of manufacturing, national security, and whether North America is about to get completely outplayed in the biggest industrial revolution since, well, since we invented the assembly line. Here's the reality nobody wants to talk about. BYD isn't some scrappy startup. They're producing more electric vehicles than Tesla, more than Ford, more than GM, combined. And now they're setting up shop in Canada while the US government is slapping 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs like we're living in some kind of economic Cold War. So what does Canada know that we don't? Or what does America know that Canada's ignoring? Buckle up, because this story has more layers than a Tesla battery pack. Let me break down what's actually happening here, because the mainstream media is either missing the point or deliberately avoiding it. BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, which is honestly a pretty good name, has been in talks with Canadian officials about establishing manufacturing presence in Canada. Now, they haven't announced a full factory yet, but they're exploring partnerships, distribution deals, and potentially assembly operations. And here's the kicker. Any car manufactured in Canada could potentially qualify for USMCA benefits. That's the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. So BYD could theoretically build cars in Canada and ship them tariff-free to the United States. Think about that for a second. The US government just implemented massive tariffs, specifically to keep Chinese EVs out of America, and there's a potential backdoor through Canada that's wide enough to drive an electric SUV through. This is either brilliant strategy by BYD or a massive oversight by American policymakers. Probably both. Now let's talk about why this matters with actual data, because opinions are worthless without facts. BYD sold over 3 million new energy vehicles last year. 3 million. Tesla sold about 1.8 million. Ford sold maybe 150,000 electric vehicles. GM is somewhere in that range too. BYD isn't just competing, they're dominating. And they're doing it with vehicles that cost 30–40% less than comparable American or European models. The BYD Seagull, their compact EV, sells in China for around $10,000. $10,000 for a brand new electric car. Meanwhile, the cheapest Tesla is what, $42,000? The average new car in America costs $48,000. Do you see the problem here? We're not competing on the same planet, let alone the same playing field. Now, the US government will tell you these tariffs are about national security and unfair subsidies. And look, they're not entirely wrong. The Chinese government has absolutely subsidized their EV industry. They've poured hundreds of billions of dollars into batteries, charging infrastructure, and manufacturing capacity. It's industrial policy on a scale that makes America's Inflation Reduction Act look like a lemonade stand. But here's what's actually happening. China decided electric vehicles were the future back in 2010. They committed. They went all in. Meanwhile, Detroit was still arguing about whether climate change was real and lobbying to keep building Suburbans that get 14 miles per gallon. Now we're a decade behind, and instead of competing, we're putting up walls. That's not strategy, that's fear. So why is Canada taking a different approach? Well, first of all, let's be clear, Canada hasn't just thrown open the doors without thinking. They're being strategic. Canada has a smaller auto industry than the US, which means they have less to protect and more to gain from disruption. If Canadian consumers can buy affordable EVs, that helps them meet their climate targets faster. It reduces transportation costs. And if BYD builds facilities in Canada, that's jobs, investment, and tax revenue. Plus, and this is important, Canada is playing a longer game with China. They want to be a critical mineral superpower. Canada has lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, all the stuff you need for batteries. If they maintain good relationships with Chinese manufacturers, they can position themselves as a key supplier in the global EV supply chain. That's smart. That's actually really smart. Here's where I'm going to say something controversial. Protectionism is just taxation on your own citizens. When the US puts 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, who pays that? American consumers. We're literally making it more expensive for Americans to buy electric vehicles because we're afraid of competition. How is that helping anyone except legacy automakers who failed to innovate fast enough? And before anyone says, but national security, yes, I get it. We don't want Chinese software in our cars, potentially sending data back to Beijing. That's a legitimate concern. But you know what? Make that the rule. Require that any vehicle sold in North America has verified, secure software that doesn't phone home. Problem solved. Don't just ban an entire country's automotive industry because it's easier than competing. Now, full disclosure, I'm obviously talking about this through a particular lens. Tesla competes directly with BYD. We're fighting for the same customers globally. And BYD is a serious competitor, probably our most serious competitor. But you know what? Competition makes everyone better. When BYD pushes prices down, it forces us to innovate faster, manufacture more efficiently, and deliver more value. That's good for consumers. That's how capitalism is supposed to work. The difference is, we're competing on product, on technology, on manufacturing efficiency. We're not asking the government to protect us from competition. We're building better cars, better batteries, and better charging networks. That's the right response to competition. Not tariffs, not walls, better products. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what this means economically. The global EV market is expected to be worth $1.5 trillion by 2030. Trillion, with a T, and right now, Chinese companies are positioned to capture maybe 40–50% of that market. Maybe more. If American and Canadian consumers can't access affordable EVs, we're going to be slower to transition away from fossil fuels, which means we're going to be more vulnerable to oil price shocks, more dependent on Middle Eastern petroleum, and less competitive in the global economy. Meanwhile, if Canada becomes a manufacturing hub for Chinese EVs, they capture jobs, investment, and economic growth that could have been in the United States. Is that what we want? To watch Canada eat our lunch while we hide behind tariff walls? Now, let me steelman the opposition's argument because it's not entirely stupid. The concern is that if we let Chinese EVs flood the market, American automotive manufacturing collapses. Detroit becomes the next Rust Belt casualty. Hundreds of thousands of jobs disappear, and we become dependent on China for transportation the same way Europe became dependent on Russia for energy. That's a legitimate strategic concern. The counterpoint is, those jobs are already at risk. Legacy automakers are struggling to transition to EVs profitably. They're losing money on every electric vehicle they sell. Meanwhile, companies like Tesla are printing money with 25% gross margins on vehicles. The question isn't whether the automotive industry is going to change, it's whether American companies are going to lead that change or become irrelevant. So what's the actual solution here? Because complaining without offering alternatives is just whining. Here's what I think needs to happen. First, the US needs massive investment in domestic battery manufacturing. Not just assembly, actual cell production, cathode and anode manufacturing, the whole stack. The Inflation Reduction Act was a start, but it's not enough. We need 10 times that investment. Second, streamline permitting and regulations for EV manufacturing. It takes years to approve a new factory in America. In China, they can go from breaking ground to production in 18 months. That's not because they ignore safety, it's because they don't have 17 different agencies all requiring separate environmental impact statements. Third, stop protecting companies that refuse to innovate. If Detroit can't compete with Chinese EVs on price and quality, the solution isn't tariffs, it's better management, better engineering, and better products. Let capitalism work. So back to Canada and BYD, what's actually going to happen? My prediction, BYD will establish some kind of presence in Canada, maybe an assembly operation, maybe just distribution. They'll test the North American market with a few models. If they're successful, they'll gradually expand. And eventually, the US will either have to drop the tariffs or watch as Canadians drive significantly cheaper, potentially better electric vehicles while Americans pay 50% more for the same technology. There's also a scenario where BYD's vehicles are just not that good for North American conditions. Maybe they don't handle cold weather well. Maybe the build quality isn't up to North American standards. Maybe the charging infrastructure and compatibility becomes a major issue. That's possible, but based on what I've seen in Europe and Asia, these aren't bad vehicles. They're legitimate competitors. Here's what I think happens over the next decade. The global automotive industry consolidates into maybe 5 or 6 major players. A couple Chinese companies, probably BYD and maybe Geely or NIO. Maybe 2 American companies if we're lucky, hopefully Tesla, and possibly Ford if they figure out EVs. A couple European manufacturers, probably Volkswagen Group, and maybe one other. And maybe 1 or 2 wildcards could be Indian, could be Korean. The countries that win in this transition are the ones that embrace competition, invest in manufacturing and supply chains, and let the best products win. The countries that lose are the ones that try to protect failing industries with tariffs and subsidies for companies that refuse to change. Look, I've said this before, but it bears repeating. The point of an economy is not to preserve jobs. It's to maximize prosperity and quality of life. If we can give every Canadian and American access to a $20,000 electric vehicle that costs $3 to fill up and requires minimal maintenance, that's a massive increase in quality of life. That's more disposable income for families. That's cleaner air. That's energy independence. The fact that this might be uncomfortable for executives at Ford who've been building phone 150 seconds for 40 years? Not really my problem. Adapt or die. That's not cruel, that's evolution. That's progress. Here's the thing that really matters. This isn't actually about cars. This is about whether North America is going to be competitive in 21st century manufacturing. EVs are just the beginning. Next, it's going to be robots. Then it's going to be AI-powered everything. Then it's going to be biotech and space technology and who knows what else. If our response to Chinese competition in EVs is to build walls and hope the problem goes away, we've already lost. Because the next industry is coming, and the one after that, and we can't tariff our way to prosperity. We have to build our way there. We have to innovate our way there. We have to outwork, outthink, and outcompete. So Canada opening the door to BYD? Maybe that's naive. Maybe they're going to regret it. Or maybe they're forcing us to ask an uncomfortable question. Are we still competitive? Can we still build the best products in the world? Or have we gotten soft, hiding behind regulations and tariffs while the rest of the world passes us by? I know what my answer is. I'm betting on American innovation, American manufacturing, and American ingenuity. But that bet only pays off if we actually compete. You can't win a race you refuse to run. The question is America ready to compete? Or are we just going to watch Canada become the testing ground for the future of transportation while we argue about protecting the past? That's the real story here. Not just about BYD or tariffs or trade policy. It's about whether we still have what it takes to lead. I think we do, but we're running out of time to prove it.